What is initiation? What is magical tradition? Find out next on Mystic Fix when we talk to the real-life witch, Gwion Raven.
Gwion Raven is a tattooed pagan, a writer, traveler, musician, cook, kitchen witch, occult shop owner, and teacher. You got quite a resume there, Gwion.
Yeah, one or two things keep me busy, that's for sure.
I'll say. So you write that you have been initiated into 3 different magical traditions. I wanted to talk about that because, first of all, some of my listeners might not know even what a magical tradition is, much less what being initiated is. So can you give us the basics on that?
Yeah, so think about it. If you're more familiar with, let's say, a Christian tradition, for instance, at some point you may choose to become baptized, or part of your growing up process is to become christened or baptized. Similarly, when you reach another age, you might go through catechism or confirmation classes. You go through a period of study, for instance, where you learn more about the mysteries of the church, what it is to be a good community member, etc., right? So within magical traditions, it's much the same. So magical traditions are often referred to as initiatory traditions. Not every magical tradition is an initiatory system, but many of them are. And again, it's a journey, as any initiation is, through some unknown, mysterious territories, often of your inner landscape, for how you relate to the world and your place in it, and maybe how you relate to a religious or magical tradition and whatever comes afterwards. So that's what an initiatory tradition is. It's this journey that one goes through, one accepts. It's not usually foisted upon you. You accept it yourself. You go through the journey. And at the end of it, perhaps some mysteries are revealed. We learn something about, if not the traditions that we're practicing, certainly a lot about ourselves. Okay, and I've been fortunate to go through several traditions.
Wonderful. So when you talk about this journey, you're talking about like Joseph Campbell with the hero's journey, the fool's journey, and we've heard Dr. Carl Jung did a lot on that, and even the tarot reflects that journey, especially with the major arcana cards. So a couple of different points. I could go so many different directions with this. First of all, you spell magical with a K, CK. And as a lot of people in these traditions do. Could you explain why?
Yeah, there's kind of an interesting past to that, but the short version is it was a way of delineating between sleight of hand magic, David Copperfield kind of magic, and the serious practice of the magical arts. So a K was added. It's accredited to one person in particular, particularly notorious character in pagan or Western esoteric tradition by the name of Aleister Crowley. Yes. But it really predates him back in the Elizabethan era. So the 1500s. There wasn't kind of universality of spelling, and magic was often spelled with a K or even a KE at the end of it. So it's a hearkening back, a differentiation from sleight of hand magic and illusion and the magical practices.
Okay, and just those weird old spellings that had a lot of give and take. Yeah,
that's right.
You mentioned Aleister Crowley, who people are so afraid of. And, of course, when he died, the London Times called him the wickedest man alive, or not alive anymore, but the wickedest man in any case. I always said that Crowley got a really bad rap, and that essentially he was given that wicked title in Victorian England. I think that's important to understand the context of the times, because he rejected traditional church, he used drugs, and he was pretty free sexually. And so basically he was a rock star.
Right. In today's world, he was a rock star. Now, he was, he was problematic. He did have some politely, let's put it, foibles, but you're right. He was somebody who challenged the institution, which is funny because, we are talking about the Hierophant card, which is all about institution and church and authority. And that was exactly what he did. He challenged that, for good or for bad sometimes, but he absolutely challenged it.
Yes. So these paths of initiation, these magical traditions that you have taken on, do you consider that faith is required, or are these just practices or rituals you adhere to, or all of it?
Yeah, so a lot of that will depend on the individual. It's often said in Western esotericism or in magical traditions that we don't actually require belief, that in many cases, or faith, in many cases, it is orthopraxic rather than orthodoxy, right? So it's about the doing. The practice is in the doing of the work as opposed to the belief in the work.
Not so different from Buddhism or Taoism or even some Jews.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. So for many years, I mentioned that I'm initiated into 3 magical traditions, and that's true. But earlier on in my life, it's funny you mentioned Buddhism. I studied with a Tibetan Rinpoche for many, many, many years and underwent an initiation through that system as well. And that really was all about living in the moment and the practices that you do each and every day, each and every moment. There's a tremendous amount of crossover between those practices and what I've found in the magical practices that I'm part of today.
So tell us, I'd be very curious to know about these traditions that you're initiated in. I've got the names of them, the Avalon Druid Order, Reclaiming, and Gardnerian Wicca. I've heard of Wicca, of course, or the Wiccans. But can you tell us a little bit about what those are?
Yeah, so in very, very broad terms, the ADO, the Avalon Druid Order, Druids have a particular view of the world. In that particular tradition, they studied a lot of the remaining lore, if you will, folk tales and myths that were around Britain, pre-Roman Britain, as much as we have. Some of the myths that we have there are encoded in songs or poems. Some of them were written down by conquerors, the Romans, for instance, later on.
Slightly biased, perhaps.
Right, exactly. So they don't always paint a great picture. But essentially, if you were to make a really broad statement, I would say that Druids were very interested in sort of, how would I say this? Walking through the world, being part of the natural landscape. This is a very, very generalization, but if you think of something like Lord of the Rings and you think of somebody like Gandalf, that would be kind of proto-druid look, if you will. They were often counselors. They were court physicians. The druids were learned people of their time. They were sort of the professors, if you will, of their time. And they went around to different chiefs and tribes and kingdoms and applied their wares. So from my perspective, this was about going back and looking at some of the earliest roots, pre-Roman practices, again, as much as we can understand them, and really submersing myself in my case, specifically, Arthurian and Welsh mythology. That's where I'm from, and I'm from Britain. So
yeah. Oh, my mother is from South Wales.
Oh, so, lovely.
Newport.
Oh, yes. Absolutely lovely.
I was in England, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, at Stonehenge on summer solstice. And they were gathering people from regionally who were in the robes, who were going to have like a special privileged access that we common tourists couldn't have. And so those were Druids, correct?
Most likely, yeah. There's certainly some Druid work that happens there. So that's kind of the short version of Druids. And I'm sure if you had a Druid on, they'd give you a very different answer, but that's kind of sort of the short version. For me, again, it was really about reconnecting to as ancient a lore as we have, and studying it. And then putting it into practice. Now, the second tradition that you mentioned is reclaiming, and that's probably the closest thing to my spiritual home, if you will. I've been part of reclaiming for more than 20 years now. Reclaiming really has its roots in the 1970s and early 80s activism movement. So very much feminist, very much earth-based, very politically active in the 80s and 90s. A lot of their focus magically was on working with communities that were afflicted by AIDS. We are a very progressive tradition as far as who is welcomed in. That was one of the hardest initiations that I ever went through. For me, it was more than a 3-year process.
And why was it so hard?
Oh, partly because I came in with expectations about what it was going to be and who I was going to be when I got done with it, right? And the unfolding of that flower of initiation took me in so many different directions. That initiation prepared me for, how would I say, probably like priesthood, if you will, like being a magical steward of that tradition. Challenged some of my preconceived ideas about what magic is and where the intersection of magic and politics lies. Really prepared me to be an excellent ritualist. And then more than anything, again, just challenged some of my sort of foundational beliefs as who I am in the world and what I deserve, and what baggage of mine is can I put down, and what belongs to other people that I don't have to carry around. So it was really sort of stripping away, as a lot of initiations do, stripping away the ego, my identity, seeing what was left, and then reconfiguring myself. So it was very much like sort of rewiring my DNA. It's the classic sort of, I started off as a caterpillar and, turned into a bunch of goop in a cocoon and then came out the other end as a butterfly.
You're making me think, for some reason, of a friend of mine who, of all things, became a hospital chaplain. And the process of, psychology that she had to go for, a kind of breaking down of her own character and addressing grief and all of these things. So is that what I'm getting from you, that it gets very deep emotionally and psychologically?
Very much so. In fact, one of the key pieces that I picked up as a practice, believe it or not, was finding a therapist during that time. Not because I had any particular issue that I was working on, although, once you start therapy, you find all kinds of things. But the idea that I had a place to go outside of the magical tradition, a place where I could safely and professionally examine what was going on. Again, for me, both personally, professionally, spiritually, in a container. One of the biggest things I'll recommend to anybody going under any kind of initiatory practice is have a therapist or a spiritual advisor that's not necessarily related to the process you're going through.
Yeah, but I think you do have to be careful in who you choose, because some people aren't open-minded enough, or I was lucky enough also to have who I called her a spiritual counselor when I was going through a hard time. And yeah, if I started talking to her about premonitions or even regular meditation, if she had been, I don't know, the therapist around the corner, that I'm sure she might have been writing me a prescription,
yes.
or sending me off to the funny farm or something.
Yes, absolutely.
So, yeah. Well, so tell us about the last one, the Gardnerian Wicca. How is that different again?
Got it. So Wicca was really started in the 1950s, near enough. Some folks will say it began in the late 1930s, but really it's kind of codified in the early 1950s with the repeal of the Witchcraft Act in England, in the United Kingdom. The man most notably known for founding it is Gerald Gardner, which is why it's called Gardnerian Wicca. There are many, many offshoots of that through the 60s and 70s, 80s, 90s. There are all kinds of different offshoots of that sort of collectively have become known as Wicca. If you've ever bumped into anybody that identifies as a witch, many, not all, will identify as a Wiccan. And in the 90s and early 2000s, you know, you'd see television programs like, I don't know, Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Charmed, and they would often have a Wiccan on the show, right? So that's how most people know that word. The difference between, say, Gardnerian Wicca or British traditional Wicca and, say, reclaiming is it's very much coven-based. It's really meant to be practiced kind of around the kitchen table, if you will, with a close group of people that come together. Unlike reclaiming, it's much more hierarchical. So you've got terms like high priest and high priestess, and there's a level of authority in there. And there are degrees as you go through the Gardnerian system. You start off as a first degree, maybe become a second, maybe even become a third. And with each one of those, there are more responsibilities and rights and permissions and things like that. Again, why I decided to seek initiation in that particular tradition was, again, it felt like if reclaiming was my public tradition, Gardnerian Wicca was my private tradition. It was my family tradition, and it offers different ways to connect into, you can call it egregore, you can call it magical vibration, you can call it current, whatever that cosmic ineffable stream is. Yeah. The Gardnerian system offers a different way in than, say, the reclaiming tradition or the Buddhist traditions or the Druid traditions. And that's what I find fascinating about it.
So do you find that these traditions, you know, are you looking for power to kind of manipulate the world with spells or magic, or is this more of a personal growth kind of thing, or a little of both?
Yeah, so again, really depends on who you speak with, right? My partner, an incredible witch and priestess in her own right, fantastic author as well, puts me to shame. She's incredible. She got started in magic when she was 15 years old and got dumped by her first boyfriend. And she thought, you know, I'm going to cast some bad juju his way for breaking my heart, right? So some people come into that, and I absolutely use spell work today. Now, do I do it to manipulate? That's an interesting word. I like to say I do it to become aligned with or be in accord with. And being in accord with nature, for instance, or again, that flow of energy. So you've probably seen thousands of books or blogs or articles or videos about manifestation work. People saying, you know, if I call out to the universe and I say, I want this thing, the universe will give me that thing, right? So that's, you know, there's a lot to that we can talk about on another episode, but if you think about spells as practice, if I'm focusing on a piece of spell work, which often includes something that might look like prayer or meditation, I might have some sacred objects. I might have tarot cards, for instance, that I'm working with, and I've put them together on an altar or some working area that I'm interacting with. Really what that helps me do is focus my attention on my intention. So what is it that I'm trying to bring about? What is it that I want to expand, grow, manifest, cut off, whatever it might be?
In the way I think of an altar or something. Yeah, okay.
That's entirely it. That's exactly it. You know, when we pull a tarot card, if we're getting a reading somewhere, often what we're doing is looking at that card for validation or looking at that card for direction, to give us some advice whether we should, you know, turn left or turn right, stay on the course we're on, run away screaming, you know, whatever it might be, right? So spell work for me is much the same. It's a way of pulling together like objects, like intentions, like energies, and using them to guide me on my way. So that's a lot of what spell work is.
sympathetic magic.
That's
right?
exactly right.
Yeah,
Sympathetic magic.
reflecting.
Like attracts
Yeah.
like. Yeah.
Well, gosh, I could talk to you all day, Guion, but unfortunately we're out of time. I'm really excited that Llewellyn is giving us a giveaway book to one lucky listener, your book, Live Ritualized. Looking forward to seeing that myself. Thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure.
And I hope we'll have you on again.
Sounds fantastic. I'd love to chat with you anytime.
Coming up in the third segment, it's tarot time.